The charcoal was a living thing in Sophia's hand, whispering across the thick paper of her sketchbook. She captured the way the late afternoon light hit the dust motes dancing over a stack of unsold canvases. Her world was here, in the Turner Gallery, a place that smelled of old paper, turpentine, and a quiet, creeping desperation. "It's not enough, Soph," her father murmured from behind the front desk, his voice thin and frayed. He ran a hand through his graying hair, his gaze fixed on a stack of red-stamped envelopes. The bank was firm. Sophia's hand stilled. She looked at him, at the deep lines of worry carved around his eyes. Her idealism, a bright and stubborn flame, fought against the cold reality of their situation. "We'll find a way, Dad. The new exhibition will bring people in. My pieces are almost ready." He just shook his head, a gesture of complete defeat that made her stomach clench. That's when she saw it. A vintage black car, gleaming like polished obsidian, pulled up to the curb. It didn't belong here, among the worn-out sedans and delivery trucks. It was predatory. A few patrons who had been browsing near the windows suddenly found reasons to leave, their faces pale as they hurried past the car. The gallery's bell chimed, a sound that was usually cheerful. Now, it was a death knell. The man who entered was not large, but his presence sucked the air from the room. He was dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it looked like a second skin. His face was sharp angles and shadows, his dark eyes missing nothing. He didn't look at the art on the walls. He didn't look at anything but her father. Sophia felt a primal instinct to step in front of her dad, to shield him. "Mr. Turner," the man said. His voice was quiet, controlled, a low murmur that was more terrifying than any shout. "We need to discuss your outstanding balance." Her father visibly trembled. "Mr. Hayes. Please. I just need more time. I have paintings, they're worth a fortune, I swear." He gestured wildly at the canvases leaning against the wall, his voice cracking with panic. Vincent Hayes gave the art a dismissive glance, his expression unchanging. "I am not an art collector." His gaze swept the room and then, for the first time, it landed on Sophia. It wasn't a leer. It was an appraisal, cold and calculating, as if he were assessing the value of a rare, fragile object. Her skin prickled under the intensity of his stare. She felt pinned, exposed. He looked back at her father, a decision already made. A flicker of something that might have been pity, or perhaps just pragmatism, crossed his features. He took a slow step forward, his expensive leather shoes silent on the worn wooden floor. "The debt is too large for money," Vincent said, his voice dropping even lower, meant only for the three of them. "But it can be settled." Sophia held her breath, a knot of ice forming in her chest. His dark eyes found hers again, locking her in place. "She will come with me. She will be my guest, under my protection." The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Sophia's mind reeled, struggling to make sense of them. A guest? Protection? It was a lie wrapped in silk. "No," she said, the word a choked whisper that barely carried. She found her voice stronger this time, fueled by a surge of pure, hot rage. "Absolutely not. You can't be serious." Vincent Hayes didn't even look at her father. His entire focus was on her, his gaze unwavering. It was as if her father had ceased to exist, a piece of furniture in a room where the only two people who mattered were him and her. "I am always serious," he replied, his tone patient, like he was explaining a simple concept to a child. "Your father has entered into a world with certain rules. Debts are honored. What I am offering is a way to honor his, without unpleasantness." Her father made a strangled sound. "Vincent, please. Don't do this. She's just a girl. She has nothing to do with this." Vincent finally broke his gaze from Sophia to glance at the older man. The look was not one of anger, but of cold disappointment. "She has everything to do with this now. You made her a part of it the moment you took my money." He turned back to Sophia, his voice softening into something more dangerous, more persuasive. "This isn't a punishment. It's a solution. You are intelligent. You can see that. Think of yourself as collateral. An insurance policy that guarantees your father's safety and cooperation. The word collateral struck her like a slap. An object. A thing to be held. Her defiance hardened. I'm not an object. No. He agreed, a slight, almost imperceptible nod. You are not. He reached into his coat and produced a set of heavy, ornate iron keys, held together on a simple steel ring. He placed them on the counter between them. The sound of the metal hitting the wood was deafeningly final. It was the sound of a closing door, of a lock turning. The choice is yours, he said calmly. But the car is waiting. And if it leaves empty, then I can no longer guarantee what happens to this gallery. Or to him. That was it. The threat, delivered so smoothly it was almost polite. Sophia looked at her father. He had crumpled in on himself, his face buried in his hands. The fight was gone, replaced by a deep, rattling shame and a terror so profound it made him shake. He looked broken. Utterly and completely broken. In that moment she knew. There was no choice. Not really. He had built this gallery for her mother, and he had run it into the ground out of grief and desperation. She couldn't let it be his tomb. A cold resolve washed over her, chilling the heat of her anger. She would do this to save him. But she would never, ever let this man see her break. She lifted her chin, meeting Vincent's dark eyes with a glare of her own. Her hand shot out, snatching the keys from the counter before he could say another word. They were heavy in her palm, colder than she expected. Her hand was trembling, but she clenched her fist around them, the metal edges digging into her skin. Fine, she bit out. She didn't look at her father as she walked past him. She couldn't bear to see his face. She walked straight to the door, Vincent following a few paces behind her, a silent, imposing shadow. The short walk to the gleaming black car felt like a mile. One of his men, stone-faced and silent, opened the back door for her. She slid inside, the leather cool against her skin. The door shut with a soft, solid thud, sealing her in. Through the tinted window, she watched her gallery, her home, shrink as the car pulled silently away from the curb. The city lights began to streak past, a glittering, indifferent blur. She was a prisoner, watching her entire life disappear in the rearview mirror. The car drove for what felt like an eternity, leaving the familiar city grid behind for a neighborhood of old money and high walls. Finally it slowed, turning towards a set of towering iron gates. They were an intricate web of black metal, sharp and beautiful, designed to keep the world out. As they swung open without a sound, Sophia felt like she was being swallowed whole. They crunched up a long gravel driveway, flanked by perfectly manicured lawns that looked too green to be real. The house that emerged from the twilight was a fortress of dark brick and stone, imposing and severe. Yet, ivy clung to its walls, and the windows glowed with a soft, warm light, a strange and unsettling combination of prison and home. Inside, the opulence was breathtaking and suffocating. A cavernous entryway with a marble floor and a glittering chandelier led into rooms filled with dark wood furniture and expensive, impersonal art. It was silent. Not peaceful, but the heavy, sterile silence of a museum after closing. There was no life here, just wealth. A woman in a crisp gray uniform appeared. This way, miss. Sophia followed her up a wide, curving staircase, Vincent's footsteps a steady, unnerving presence behind her. She was led to a room at the end of a long hall. It was beautiful, she couldn't deny it. A massive bed with a silk duvet, a velvet chaise lounge, and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves already stocked with books. It was a luxurious cage. Her eyes were immediately drawn to the glass doors leading to a small, stone balcony. She stepped outside, needing air. The balcony overlooked a sprawling, walled garden. Below, arranged among rose bushes and stone pathways, were dozens of ornate, gilded cages. Inside them, colorful birds fluttered and chirped, their bright feathers a stark contrast to their confinement. She felt a painful lurch in her chest. They were just like her. Trapped in something beautiful, with no way out. It's peaceful here. Vincent's voice came from the doorway behind her. Sophia spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. He stood there, watching her, his expression unreadable. "It's a prison," she corrected, her voice shaking slightly. He walked into the room, his presence making it feel smaller. "The rules are simple. You have freedom within the estate walls. The grounds are extensive. You will be given anything you need: books, food, art supplies. Your sketchbook and charcoal will be brought from the gallery." He paused, his gaze intense. "But you will have no contact with the outside world. No phone. No computer. No letters." The finality of his words stole her breath. He was cutting her off from everything she knew, isolating her completely. A hot wave of defiance surged through her. "I'm not one of your possessions," she snapped, her hands balling into fists at her sides. He didn't even flinch. He took a step closer, and she had to fight the instinct to step back. He was close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "You are my guest," he said, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. "And my guests are expected to show loyalty." The unspoken threat hung between them, thick and heavy. Loyalty. It was just another word for obedience. For submission. She saw it for what it was, a warning. He was telling her that her father's safety, and maybe even her own, depended on her behavior. The strange, simmering pull she felt towards him was terrifying, a confusing mix of fear and something else she refused to name. He held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent battle of wills, before he turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. The click of the latch echoed in the cavernous silence. Sophia was alone. She walked back to the balcony, her legs unsteady, and wrapped her arms around herself. Below, a small yellow bird beat its wings against the bars of its gilded cage, a frantic, useless struggle. She knew exactly how it felt. The days bled into one another, each marked only by the shifting light across the stone floors. A fragile routine took hold. Sophia woke, she ate the exquisite food brought to her on a silver tray, and she drew. Her sketchbook, her only true possession, became her sanctuary and her weapon. She filled its pages with the symbols of her confinement. She drew the frantic, desperate eyes of the birds in the garden. She drew the cold, intricate twists of the iron gates. She drew the long, oppressive shadows that the mansion cast in the late afternoon. She drew everything except him. To capture Vincent Hayes on paper felt like a surrender, a way of admitting he was a permanent part of her world. She refused. One afternoon, she was in the vast library, sketching the way dust danced in a sunbeam slanting through the tall arched window. Vincent was at the far end of the room, standing before the unlit fireplace with one of his men. Sophia kept her head down, trying to make herself small, to fade into the background. But their voices carried in the cathedral-like silence. "Gallo is getting bold," the man said, his tone sharp. "He's making moves on the North Docks. We need to send a message he'll understand. He has a sister." Sophia's charcoal froze over the page. Her blood ran cold. Vincent's reply was immediate, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "No." The word was a blade, sharp and absolute. "But boss, it's the perfect leverage." "Leo," Vincent cut in, his voice dangerously soft. "We don't involve their families. We don't harm women. That is not our way. Find another." The man, Leo, fell silent. After a tense moment, he just nodded. "Yes, boss." He left the room without another word, leaving Sophia alone in the heavy silence with the monster who had just drawn a moral line in the sand. She couldn't process it. This man, this kidnapper who traded in human collateral, had rules? He had a code that protected the innocent while he built an empire on fear? The contradiction was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She had painted him in her mind as a creature of pure darkness, a simple villain. But this was something else entirely. Something more complicated and, somehow, more terrifying. Later that evening, she found him standing on a stone terrace overlooking the darkening grounds. She didn't know what compelled her to approach him. It was a reckless, stupid impulse, but she couldn't stop herself. He heard her footsteps and turned. In the twilight, his face was all angles and shadow. You have rules for violence? The question came out breathless, an accusation. He didn't seem surprised by her directness. He simply watched her, his dark eyes searching her face for something. There are rules for everything, he said, his voice a low rumble. Protecting women and children? She pressed, incredulous. How does that fit with this? She gestured vaguely around them, at the gilded cage he had built. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. He looked away from her, out towards the caged birds settling for the night. A man without a code is just a beast, he said, more to himself than to her. A beast can't build an empire. It can only destroy. He looked back at her then, and his gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. A beast gets put down. Sophia stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man who owned her was not a mindless monster. He was a king with a dark and twisted code of honor. And she was beginning to realize that made him infinitely more dangerous than the devil she had imagined. She was reaching for a glass of water on her nightstand when her hand trembled, a sudden, violent tremor she couldn't control. The glass slipped, hitting the stone floor with a shockingly loud crash. Shards skittered across the polished surface, glittering like fallen stars in the lamplight. Sophia froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound was an explosion in the mansion's oppressive silence. Before she could even take a breath to curse, her bedroom door burst open. Two of Vincent's guards filled the doorway, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the room for a threat. One of them had his hand resting on the butt of a gun tucked inside his jacket. They weren't looking at her with anger for the mess. They were looking for what had caused it. They were looking for danger. Miss? Are you all right? The first guard asked, his voice a low, urgent rumble. Sophia could only nod, her throat tight. I just dropped a glass. The men exchanged a look. The tension in their shoulders eased, but only slightly. We'll have someone clean that up immediately, the second one said, already speaking into a device on his wrist. They backed out of the room as quietly as they had entered, closing the door behind them. She stood there, surrounded by broken glass, her body shaking. The speed of their response was terrifying. It wasn't a punishment. It was a protocol. The incident, so small and stupid, was a stark reminder of her reality. The world outside these gates was so dangerous that a shattered glass was treated like a gunshot. And here, inside the walls of her prison, she was safer than she had ever been in her life. The thought was a confusing, bitter pill to swallow. She hated him for making her a prisoner, but a small, traitorous part of her felt a wave of relief, a grudging gratitude for the invisible shield he had placed around her. Sleep was impossible after that. The conflicting emotions churned inside her, a sickening mix of resentment and security. Needing air, she slipped out of her room and down the grand, silent staircase. She found a door that led out into the walled garden. The night air was cool and smelled of damp earth and roses. Moonlight silvered the leaves and cast long shadows from the stone benches. She found a secluded spot near the cages, where the birds were sleeping soundly, their heads tucked under their wings. She opened her sketchbook, the paper a comforting weight in her lap, and just sat, listening to the crickets. You couldn't sleep? His voice came out of the darkness, so close it made her jump. Vincent stepped out from the shadow of a stone archway, a ghost in a perfectly tailored suit. He moved with a predator's silence she was beginning to recognize. She just shook her head, unable to find her voice. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. He walked over and sat on the other end of the bench. The space between them crackled with an energy that was both frightening and magnetic. He nodded toward the sketchbook in her lap. May I? It felt like he was asking to see her soul. Her hand tightened on the cover, a reflexive instinct to protect her last private space. But then, slowly, she pushed it across the stone bench toward him. He picked it up gently. He didn't flip through it quickly. He turned each page with a deliberate, almost respectful slowness. He saw the angry slashes of charcoal that formed the iron gates. He saw the birds with their wide, desperate eyes. He saw the long, lonely shadows of the mansion's hallways. He paused on a page where she had drawn a single, perfect feather lying on the ground, a symbol of a freedom she couldn't have. He looked up from the book, and the moonlight caught the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. His gaze held hers, and for a moment, the world fell away. There was no captor, no captive. Just two people sitting on a bench in a moonlit garden. "You see things others miss," he said. His voice was softer than she had ever heard it, a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't just about her art. He was telling her that he saw her. He understood what she was trying to say with her drawings. The connection was so sudden, so unexpected, it left her breathless. He closed the sketchbook and slid it back to her. Then he stood, gave her a brief, almost imperceptible nod, and walked back into the shadows, disappearing as silently as he had arrived. Sophia sat there for a long time, her heart pounding a wild rhythm against her chest. She went back to her room, the encounter replaying in her mind, his soft words echoing in the silence. She opened her sketchbook to a clean, white page. She still couldn't bring herself to draw his face. That felt too final, too much like a surrender. Instead, her charcoal began to move, her hand guided by a force she didn't understand. She drew his hands as she remembered them from moments ago, turning the pages of her book. She sketched their strength, the confident line of his fingers, the controlled power in them. It was a dangerous, intimate drawing, a secret she was telling only to herself. The monster was becoming a man, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. The quiet routine shattered a week later. Sophia was sketching the bars of a birdcage, trying to capture the way the afternoon sun made them look like gold, when Vincent appeared in the library doorway. He wasn't wearing his usual suit. Instead, he was in a dark button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the corded muscle there. "We're going out," he said. It wasn't a question. Sophia's head snapped up, her heart giving a nervous jolt. "Out where?" "I have a club in the South Loop. I need to be seen there tonight. And you will be seen with me." He looked at her simple dress. "Wear something else. There's a closet in your room. Find something black." The command sent a chill through her. He was putting her on display. She found the closet he mentioned, a walk-in filled with clothes in her size, all with their tags still on. Dresses, shoes, coats. Another gilded facet of her cage. She chose the simplest black dress she could find, a sheath that felt more like armor than clothing. The club was a den of shadows and secrets, lit only by the flickering glow of hundreds of candles. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and whiskey. Men in tailored suits and women in glittering dresses spoke in hushed, important tones. Every head turned as they entered. Sophia felt their eyes on her, 1,000 tiny needles against her skin. She was an accessory, a statement. Vincent's hand rested lightly on the small of her back, a gesture that could have been mistaken for affection but felt like a brand, a claim of ownership. He led her to a secluded booth in the back, upholstered in dark red velvet. From here, he could see the entire room. He was a king surveying his court. Sophia's gaze drifted across the sea of faces, and that's when she saw him. In a shadowed corner, a man was watching them. He was younger than Vincent, with a cruel, handsome face and a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. There was a restless, volatile energy about him that was the exact opposite of Vincent's cold control. When he saw her looking, his smirk widened. He lifted his glass of amber liquid, tilting it towards Vincent in a slow, mocking toast. She felt the change in Vincent instantly. It was as if the air around him had dropped below freezing. His body went rigid beside her, his hand on her back tightening almost painfully. The man she had shared a moment with in the garden was gone, replaced by the ruthless Mafia boss she had first met in her father's gallery. The predator was back. "Who is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No one you need to know," Vincent replied, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He didn't look at the man again. He looked at her. And for the first time, she saw cold fury in his eyes, directed not at the man in the corner, but at her. As if her mere presence, her being seen, was the problem. The ride home was a suffocating torment. The silence in the car was a living thing, heavy and cold. Sophia stared out the window, watching the city lights blur past, her stomach twisted into a tight, aching knot. She replayed the scene in her head, trying to understand what she had done wrong. She had done nothing. She had simply existed. Back in the mansion, the heavy front door clicked shut behind them, sealing them in the sterile silence. She started to head for the stairs, desperate to escape him, to hide in her room. Sophia. She froze, her hand on the banister. She turned slowly. He was standing in the center of the marble floor, his face a mask of stone. "Give it to me," he said. "Give you what?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The sketchbook." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. "No." It was a choked whisper. Her sketchbook was her sanity. It was the only place she could scream. "There can be no record of this house," he stated, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. He took a step toward her. "Of me. It's just drawings," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "It's just for me. No one will ever see it. I will not have my life, my world, documented by anyone. It's a liability." He held out his hand, palm up. "An order. Give it to me. Now." She saw it for what it was. A punishment. He was punishing her for being seen by that man, for being a weakness he couldn't control. He was severing her from her only outlet, taking away the one thing that was truly hers. Tears of rage and despair burned at the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. With a shaking hand, she reached into the small bag she carried and pulled out the worn, leather-bound book. Her fingers clung to it for a moment, a last, desperate caress. It felt like she was handing over a piece of her soul. She placed it in his outstretched hand. He took it without a word, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting, electric moment. Then he turned and walked into his study, closing the door behind him with a soft, final click. She was left alone in the vast, empty entryway, the silence pressing in on her. The gilded cage had just gotten infinitely smaller, and for the first time, she felt the true, crushing weight of its bars. The next morning, the silence in the mansion was different. It wasn't just quiet, it was dead. The absence of her sketchbook on the nightstand was a gaping wound. It had been her voice, her shield, her memory. Now, there was nothing. Sophia felt hollowed out, stripped of her only armor. Vincent found her standing by the balcony doors, staring down at the caged birds. He was dressed for travel, a dark wool coat draped over his arm. He didn't come close. "I have business to attend to," he said, his voice clipped and impersonal. "I will be gone for a few days." She didn't turn around. "And I'm to remain your perfect little prisoner?" A beat of silence. "You are to remain safe," he corrected, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Do not do anything foolish." Then he was gone. The soft click of her bedroom door closing behind him sounded heavier than usual. An hour later, out of a restless, angry impulse, she walked over and tried the handle. It didn't turn. A cold dread washed over her. She rattled it again, harder this time. It was locked. From the outside. Panic, sharp and icy, shot through her veins. He had locked her in. The illusion of freedom within the estate, the beautiful lie of being guest, had just evaporated. This room, with its silk sheets and velvet furniture, was a cell. She was in a cage within a cage. Her meals were brought on a tray and left just inside the door by a maid who wouldn't meet her eyes. The polite smiles were gone, replaced by a nervous, guarded efficiency. They were her jailers now. The entire estate had become her prison, and this room was solitary confinement. Her simmering defiance began to boil. He could take her sketchbook, he could lock her away, but he could not break her. Driven by a desperate need for some shred of control, she began to test the boundaries. She searched the room for anything she could use, A loose floorboard, a weak window latch. Nothing. The place was a beautiful, seamless trap. Her only hope was the staff. She waited for the young maid who brought her dinner, a girl named Elena with kind, nervous eyes. When Elena set the tray down, Sophia moved to block the door. "Please," Sophia said, her voice low and urgent. "I need a phone. Just for one call. No one has to know." Elena's face went pale. She shook her head, trying to step around Sophia. "I can't, miss. Please don't ask me." Sophia went to the closet and pulled out a delicate pearl necklace, one of the many expensive, soulless things Vincent had provided. She pushed it into the maid's hands. "Take this. It's worth thousands. Just let me use your phone for 5 minutes." Elena dropped the necklace as if it had burned her. It clattered onto the floor, the sound echoing in the tense silence. "No, miss," she whispered, her eyes wide with genuine terror. "Mr. Hayes, he sees everything. I have a family. Please." She practically scrambled out of the room, pulling the door shut with a final, definitive click. The refusal was more absolute than any locked door. She was utterly, completely alone. Her isolation was a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. She walked onto the balcony and looked down at the gardens. As the sun began to set, she saw them. The number of guards patrolling the grounds had doubled. They moved with a silent, lethal purpose, their dark forms weaving between the rose bushes. Any lingering confusion, any flicker of the strange connection she had felt with Vincent, was burned away by the cold, hard reality of her situation. She wasn't his guest. She wasn't his collateral. She was his possession, locked away in a box until he decided to return. Her defiance curdled into a cold, hard knot of desperation. He thought he could contain her. He was wrong. 2 days later, the sound of a key turning in the lock was a violent crack in the silence. Sophia's head snapped up from the window she'd been staring out of, her heart instantly hammering against her ribs. The door swung open. Vincent stood there. He looked different. The exhaustion was etched deep under his eyes, but it had sharpened his features, making him look harder, leaner, more dangerous. He was a blade that had just been honed on a whetstone. His dark eyes swept over the room and landed on her, and there was no warmth in them, only a cold, assessing light. He knew. "Get up," he said, his voice a low command. "We're going to the library." He didn't wait for her. He just turned and walked away, leaving the door open. An invitation that was really an order. Her legs felt unsteady, but a surge of defiant anger propelled her forward. She followed him down the long, silent hall, her footsteps echoing on the polished wood. She wouldn't let him see her fear. He was waiting for her in the library, standing in the center of the room like a storm cloud about to break. He didn't speak until she was a few feet away from him. The air crackled with a tension so thick she could barely breathe. "Were you trying to run?" he asked. The question was flat, devoid of emotion, which made it all the more terrifying. She lifted her chin. "I was trying to escape my cage." "Who were you going to call?" he pressed, ignoring her defiance. He took a step closer, invading her space, forcing her to look up at him. "Your father? The police? Did you think they could protect you? Protect me from you?" She shot back, her voice laced with venom. A muscle ticked in his jaw. "No. Protect you from them." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph, holding it out for her to see. It was a simple 4x6 glossy print. Her blood ran cold. The picture was of her father, standing on the sidewalk outside the gallery. He was looking over his shoulder, a nervous, hunted expression on his face. In the background, leaning against a car and watching him, was one of the men who had been with Marco Gallo at the club. Sophia's breath hitched. The air left her lungs in a painful rush. The world tilted on its axis. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely a tremor. "This," Vincent said, his voice a blade of ice, "is the protection you were so eager to escape. The men you were seen with at the club. They'd been watching him ever since. He lowered the photo, his dark eyes boring into hers, pinning her in place with the sheer force of his will. They are waiting for me to make a mistake. For you to make a mistake. They are waiting for an excuse to get to him, to prove I can't protect what's mine. He took another step, his presence overwhelming. My loyalty keeps him safe. Your disloyalty puts a target on his back. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her carefully constructed anger, her righteous defiance, it all crumbled into dust, replaced by a wave of pure, sickening terror. It wasn't just about her anymore. It had never been just about her. Her attempts to escape, her desperate grabs for freedom, they weren't acts of bravery. They were acts of foolishness that could have gotten her father killed. She saw it all now, with horrifying clarity. Vincent wasn't just her captor. He was her father's shield. He had taken her to keep him safe from men who played a much dirtier, more vicious game. The walls of the mansion weren't just to keep her in. They were to keep the real monsters out. The anger she felt for him was still there, a hot coal in her chest. But now it was tangled with a new, complicated emotion, a terrifying, reluctant dependence. The man who had taken her life away was the only one who could save it. The thought was a poison that spread through her veins, paralyzing her. She was trapped, not just by his locks and guards, but by the impossible, twisted truth of her situation. The photograph fell from her numb fingers, fluttering to the expensive rug. The image of her father's terrified face was burned into her mind. Sophia sank onto the edge of a leather armchair, her body feeling heavy and useless. The library, with its towering shelves of books, felt like it was closing in on her, the walls lined with stories of worlds she could no longer reach. She wasn't just a captive. She was a liability, a trigger for a gun pointed directly at her father's head. Vincent watched her, his expression unreadable. The cold fury was gone, replaced by something else. A quiet, calculating intensity. He had broken her defiance down to its raw components, fear and love. Now, he was going to rebuild it into something he could use. He walked over to the large mahogany desk and picked up her sketchbook. Her heart seized, thinking he was going to throw it in the fire. Instead, he walked back and held it out to her. Sophia stared at it, then up at him, confused. "Take it," he said, his voice softer now, a low murmur that cut through the silence. "I was wrong to take it from you." Her hand trembled as she reached out, and her fingers brushed against his. She snatched the book back, clutching it to her chest like a shield. It was her voice, her soul, and he was returning it. It was a truce she didn't understand. "Gallo wants a war," Vincent said, his tone shifting from personal to strategic. He began to pace slowly in front of the fireplace. "My territory, my business. But he knows I have rules. He knows I don't bring families into it. So he found a way to make me break my own code." He stopped and looked at her. "He targeted your father, knowing I would have to collect. He wanted me to hurt an old man, to look like a hypocrite. A beast. And when that didn't work, he planned to use you as the leverage instead." He was giving her the pieces of the puzzle, laying them out one by one. He needed her to see the whole, terrifying picture. "Draw what you see," he said, his gaze dropping to the book in her hands. "The guards, the gates, this house. Understand what you're in the middle of. This isn't just about you and me anymore." Sophia's mind raced, trying to process it all. The fear for her father was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but beneath it, something else was stirring. Her analytical mind, the part of her that could deconstruct a painting to its core elements, began to fire up. She looked at Vincent, not as her captor, but as a piece of this dangerous composition. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. The question surprised him. He stilled, watching her with a new focus. "Why what? Why my father?" she pressed, her thoughts sharpening. "Why the gallery? He's nothing. A small, failing business owner with a few bad debts. There have to be bigger players, more important people you could have used for this game." She was no longer speaking as a victim. She was speaking like a strategist. A flicker of something, respect maybe, crossed his features. He was easy, Vincent admitted, his voice a low confession. Visible. Sentimental. Gallo knew taking the gallery would be a public move. And he knew your father had a weakness. Me, she whispered. Vincent gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. You. She looked down at the sketchbook, its worn leather cover a familiar comfort against her palms. He was right. She had to understand. If her father's life depended on her actions, she couldn't afford to be a terrified girl in a locked room anymore. She had to see the things others missed. The anger was still there, a hot ember burning deep inside her. But it was no longer just rage. It was fuel. Tell me everything, she said, looking up at him, her gaze clear and resolved. Tell me everything you know about Marco Gallo. A strange truce had settled over the mansion. It wasn't comfortable, but the raw tension had been replaced by a quiet, watchful current. A few days after their library confrontation, Vincent had a box delivered to her room. One of his men, stone-faced and silent, had simply set it on the floor. From the gallery, he'd said. Mr. Hayes thought you might want some things. It was a calculated gesture of peace, another move in his complicated game, and she knew it. But the sight of the familiar, dusty cardboard box made her chest ache with a homesickness so sharp it felt like a physical pain. That night, unable to sleep, she finally opened it. It was mostly junk. Old invoices, exhibition pamphlets, dried-up tubes of paint. She dug deeper, searching for a forgotten sketchbook, a photograph, anything that felt like home. Her fingers brushed against something hard at the bottom. She pulled it out. It was a small, plain black ledger, the kind you could buy at any office supply store. She had never seen it before. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, made her open it. The pages were filled with her father's elegant, slanted handwriting. At first, it looked like what she expected, notes on gallery expenses, supplier costs. Then she turned a page and saw a list of loans. Her stomach clenched when she saw the largest entry, a single, massive sum from Hayes Holdings, Vincent's company. But it was the entries before that one that made her pause. There were dozens of them, smaller amounts, stretching back over a year. They came from a company called G Corp Investments. The interest rates, scrawled in the margins, were astronomical. They were predatory. She watched the numbers climb, page after page, a chronicle of her father's spiraling desperation. G Corp Investments. The name snagged in her memory, pulling at something. She closed her eyes, trying to place it. Where had she heard it? It wasn't from the gallery. It was from here. From this house. Her mind flashed back to the day Vincent had taken her sketchbook, the way he had walked into his study and closed the door. She'd caught a glimpse of his desk. It had been covered in files. One folder, left open, had been labeled in thick black marker, Gallo. And on the top page, a list of his known assets and shell corporations. Her heart stopped. The first name on that list. It was G Corp Investments. The ledger fell from her hands, landing with a soft thud on the rug. The air rushed out of her lungs. The pieces of the puzzle didn't just click into place. They slammed together with the force of a car crash, leaving her reeling in the wreckage. Her father hadn't just been in debt to Vincent. He had been trapped by Marco Gallo first. Gallo had been squeezing him, bleeding him dry with those impossible loans, pushing him closer and closer to the edge. Taking Vincent's money hadn't been a simple business decision to save the gallery. It had been a desperate, last-ditch attempt to escape a worse devil. Her father had run from a shark straight into the jaws of a lion, praying the lion had rules the shark did not. And her. She was the final piece. The checkmate. Sophia sank to the floor, her mind a whirlwind of horrifying clarity. This was never about a simple debt. Gallo had engineered the entire thing. He had set her father up, knowing he would eventually have to turn to Vincent, his biggest rival. He had pushed her family toward a cliff, knowing exactly who would be waiting at the bottom. Her abduction, the twisted bargain that had stolen her life, it wasn't Vincent's idea. It was the final move in Gallo's trap. A move designed to force Vincent's hand, to make him break his own sacred code about not involving families. Gallo wanted to paint him as a monster, a hypocrite who took innocent girls as payment. He hadn't just wanted a war. He wanted to destroy Vincent's honor before he destroyed his empire. She stared at the open ledger on the floor. It wasn't just a book of numbers. It was a confession. It was proof. And she was the one holding it. The ledger felt heavy in her hands, heavier than paper and ink. It was a weight of secrets and lies, a testament to her father's desperation and another man's treachery. Sophia stood in the silent hallway outside Vincent's study, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was a risk. A terrible, enormous risk. She was about to walk into the lion's den and show him exactly how he'd been played. He could kill her for it. He could decide she and her father were liabilities he could no longer afford. But the fear was secondary now, a cold hum beneath the surface of a new, sharp-edged resolve. She was done being a pawn. She was done being a victim. If she was going to be in the middle of this war, she would be a player, not the prize. She didn't knock. The heavy oak door swung open under her hand. Vincent was at his desk, a single lamp casting his face in sharp angles of light and shadow. He looked up, his dark eyes narrowing at her intrusion. A flicker of annoyance crossed his features, but he didn't speak. He waited, a predator observing an unexpected move. Sophia walked across the plush rug, her steps silent, until she stood before the massive desk that served as a barrier between them. She held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to show the tremor in her hands. With a steady, deliberate motion, she placed the black ledger on the polished wood. The sound was a soft, definitive thud in the quiet room. "My father's," she said, her voice clear and even. "It was in a box from the gallery." Vincent's gaze dropped to the book, then returned to her face, questioning, suspicious. "He didn't touch it. He took loans before he ever came to you," she continued, the words tumbling out now, a cascade of revelation. "From a company called G Corp Investments. They were bleeding him dry." She pointed a single, trembling finger at the ledger. "It's all in there." She took a breath, steeling herself for the final, fatal piece of the puzzle. "G Corp Investments. It's one of Marco Gallo's shell companies, isn't it?" The air in the room went still. The change in Vincent was instantaneous and terrifying. It wasn't a loud explosion of rage, but a sudden, absolute vacuum. All movement, all emotion, seemed to be sucked out of him, leaving behind a stillness that was more menacing than any threat. He slowly reached out and pulled the ledger toward him, his eyes never leaving hers. He opened it. Sophia held her breath as he turned the pages, his expression a mask of stone. His gaze scanned the neat columns of her father's handwriting, the damning list of dates and figures. She watched the muscle in his jaw clench, a single, tight knot of controlled fury. He was reading the story of her family's ruin, a plot that had been written by his enemy. She let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable, and then she delivered the final blow. "He set you up," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried across the desk like a gunshot. "Gallo pushed my father into your arms, knowing you'd have to collect. He wanted you to break your own code. He wanted to make you a monster." She looked him straight in the eye, the truth a bitter acid on her tongue. "And I was the bait." He closed the ledger. The sound was soft, but it echoed with a terrible finality. He leaned back in his leather chair, the faint light catching the cold fury that now burned in his eyes. But it wasn't directed at her. She saw it with a shocking clarity. His anger wasn't for her, or even for her father's foolishness. It was a pure, chilling rage reserved for his rival. The fury of a king whose honor had been used as a weapon against him. In that moment, everything changed. The invisible walls between them, captor and captive, monster and victim, crumbled into dust. She was no longer just the collateral. She was the one who had brought him the truth. She was the one who had seen the trap he had missed. They were two people, caught in the same snare, and for the first time, they were on the same side. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and the distance was gone. The cold assessment was replaced by a sharp, focused intensity that made her feel more seen than she ever had in her life. His trust, a thing she never thought she'd want, settled over her like a heavy cloak. "Tell me everything you know." The study was no longer a cage, it was a war room. The air, once thick with menace, now crackled with a different kind of energy, a sharp, focused intensity that pulled Sophia into its current. She was no longer a piece on the board. She was a player. She sat in the leather chair opposite his desk, the damning ledger still between them, and she told him everything. She spoke of the nervous men who had started visiting the gallery months ago, the hushed phone calls her father would end the moment she entered a room, the general feeling of dread that had settled over their lives long before Vincent's black car ever appeared. Vincent didn't sit. He paced before the cold fireplace, a caged lion contemplating the bars of a trap he hadn't seen. He listened without interruption, his dark eyes fixed on her, absorbing every detail. He was mapping the battlefield in his mind, and she was providing the landmarks. "He got sloppy," Vincent said, his voice a low growl. "He was so focused on the trap for me, he left a trail." He stopped pacing and leaned over the desk, his hands flat on the polished wood. "But we need more than a ledger. We need him. We need to get him in a place where he feels safe enough to talk." Sophia's mind raced, sifting through the memories, the fragments of conversations she had dismissed as unimportant. "The river," she said suddenly, the words coming out in a rush. "My father mentioned it. A few weeks before you, before everything. He was on the phone with someone he called Mr. G. They were talking about storage. Mr. G wanted to use the gallery's back rooms, but my dad said no, it was too public. He suggested an old warehouse his grandfather used to own, down by the south branch of the river." Vincent's eyes narrowed. He straightened up, a flicker of something sharp and dangerous in his gaze. "Where is this warehouse?" "I don't know exactly. Just that it's abandoned. And it's right on the water." It was enough. Vincent moved to a cabinet and pulled out a large, rolled-up map of the city's industrial sector. He spread it across the desk, the paper crinkling in the silence. He pointed to a desolate stretch of docks and decaying brick buildings. "Here. It has to be here. A perfect place for illicit shipments. Untraceable." He looked up at her, and she saw the plan forming in his eyes. It was cold, ruthless, and efficient. "Your father will call him. He'll say he has something new to offer, something to finally clear his slate. Information. He will arrange a meeting. At the warehouse." Sophia finished for him, her heart beginning to pound. "Yes." Vincent's gaze was hard. "My men will be in place. We will take him." Sophia shook her head, a surge of adrenaline washing away her fear. This was her life, her family. She would not sit in this beautiful prison while her father walked into a trap, even a staged one. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. Vincent's brow furrowed. "No? That's not the whole plan," she stated, standing up to face him across the desk. "I have to be there." "Absolutely not." He shot back, his voice dropping into that dangerously soft tone. "It's too great a risk." "It's a greater risk if I'm not," she argued, her hands balling into fists. "Gallo is arrogant. He'll expect your men to be lurking in the shadows. He'll be careful. But he won't expect me. He sees me as a prize, a weakness. A frightened little girl. He'll get careless around me. He'll gloat." She leaned forward, her eyes locked on his, pleading with him to see. "You need him to confess he targeted my father to get to you. He'll only do that for an audience he thinks he can intimidate. He'll do it for me." He stared at her for a long, tense moment, a silent battle of wills raging between them. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the cold strategist warring with the man whose code was to protect women from exactly this kind of danger. She had become his greatest liability and, in the same breath, his most unexpected weapon. Finally, he gave a slow, reluctant nod. The decision was made. "Fine," he bit out, the word clipped. "But you will do exactly as I say. You will wear a wire. You will get him to admit what he did, and the second you have it, you give the signal and you get behind me. Understood? Understood, she replied, her voice a steady, determined whisper. A dangerous partnership had been forged in the fire of their shared enemy. They were no longer captor and captive. They were conspirators bound together by a blueprint for a takedown. And as she looked at the man who had stolen her freedom, she realized with a terrifying certainty that she was about to trust him with her life. The rain came down in hard, silver sheets, turning the city into a blur of bleeding light. Inside the vintage black car, the only sounds were the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers and the frantic beat of Sophia's own heart. Vincent drove, his hands steady on the wheel, his profile a sharp silhouette against the watery chaos outside. The silence between them was a heavy, living thing, filled with unspoken fears and the cold purpose of their mission. He pulled the car into a dark alley across from the docks, cutting the engine. The sudden quiet was deafening. The rain hammered on the roof, trapping them in a bubble of suffocating tension. He'll be waiting inside, Vincent said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the noise. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a tiny, metallic object. A hidden microphone. Clip this to the inside of your dress near the collar. My men and I will hear everything. It has a tracker. He handed it to her. The metal was cold against her trembling fingers. She fumbled with the clasp, her hands slick with nervous sweat. Here. He leaned across the console, his presence filling the small space. His scent, something clean and sharp, like winter air, enveloped her. He took the device from her, his fingers brushing hers. A jolt, hot and electric, shot up her arm. He didn't seem to notice. With deft, impersonal movements, he reached toward her and clipped the microphone securely to the inside of her dress. His knuckles grazed the skin just below her collarbone, and her breath hitched. For a heart-stopping second, his dark eyes met hers, and the professional distance between them vanished. He pulled back, the moment broken. The signal will be a code word. The debt is settled. Say it loud and clear. That's when we move in. He looked at her, his expression hard, all business once more. Your only job is to get him to admit he targeted your father to get to me. Understand? Nothing else matters. Don't be a hero. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. This was it. The point of no return. She put her hand on the cold door handle, ready to step out into the storm, into the danger. But she had to know. She turned back to him. And what happens after? The question hung in the air between them, more important than Gallo, more important than the warehouse. What happens to us? He met her gaze, and the mask of the Mafia boss slipped away, revealing the man she had seen in the moonlit garden. His eyes were dark, intense, and held a depth of emotion she couldn't begin to name. After, he said, his voice a quiet, solemn vow, you are free. The promise was a physical thing, settling over her with an impossible weight. Freedom. It was everything she had wanted, everything she had fought for. But hearing him say it now felt different. It felt less like an escape and more like an ending. She held his gaze for a second longer, a silent pact passing between them. Then she nodded, a single, sharp dip of her chin. She opened the door and stepped out. The cold, driving rain was a shock, plastering her dress to her skin in seconds. The door of the black car clicked shut behind her, a sound of finality. Across the street, the rain-soaked warehouse loomed like a sleeping beast. It was a cavern of shadows and secrets, and she was about to walk right into its mouth. Alone. But armed with a monster's promise. The warehouse was a cathedral of rot and shadow. Rain hammered on the corrugated metal roof, each drop a tiny explosion echoing in the vast, empty space. Water dripped from rusted beams, forming dark puddles on the cracked concrete floor. It smelled of decay and damp earth. In the center of the cavernous room, illuminated by a single, bare bulb hanging from a long cord, stood two figures. Her father, looking small and broken, his shoulders slumped in defeat. And beside him, Marco Gallo, radiating a smug, predatory confidence. Gallo's cruel smile widened as she approached, his eyes raking over her drenched form. Well, well, he drawled, his voice slick with false charm. Look what the storm blew in. Did Hayes finally run out of men to send? Her father wouldn't meet her eyes. The shame rolling off him was a palpable thing, a heavy cloak of failure. Sophia, you shouldn't be here, he mumbled, his voice a ragged whisper. Quiet, old man, Gallo snapped, not even glancing at him. His full attention was on Sophia, enjoying her fear, feeding on it. Your daughter and I are just getting acquainted. You see, this is what happens when men like Hayes think they're untouchable. He hides behind his codes and his walls, but his weaknesses always find their way out into the rain. Sophia's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but Vincent's promise echoed in her mind. You are free. That freedom wasn't something to be given. It had to be taken. She looked past Gallo's arrogant smirk, past her father's shame, and saw the entire, ugly chessboard. She wasn't just a pawn to be sacrificed. She took a step forward, and the sound of her shoe on the wet concrete was a sharp crack in the tense silence. You're wrong, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Gallo laughed, a short, ugly sound. Am I? You don't want his territory, she continued, her voice gaining strength, ringing with a newfound power she didn't know she possessed. You want to destroy his honor. That was the whole point, wasn't it? Her father's head snapped up, his eyes wide with confusion. Gallo's smile faltered, just for a second. You trapped my father with your shell company, Sophia said, laying out his entire scheme like a prosecutor in a courtroom. You bled him dry until he had no choice but to go to your biggest rival. You knew Vincent Hayes had a code about families. You engineered this whole thing to force him to break it, to make him look like a monster in front of the whole city. She took another step, her gaze burning into him. You didn't want a debt paid. You wanted a war, and you used my family as the spark to light the fire. The truth hung in the air, stark and undeniable. Gallo's amusement curdled into something cold and vicious. He dropped the charming facade, and the beast beneath was revealed. He laughed again, but this time it was raw and menacing. You're smarter than you look. And what a waste. All that intelligence, and you're still just his property. He pulled a gun from the waistband of his pants. The movement was a fluid, practiced motion. He didn't point it at her father. He pointed it directly at her. But you're right about one thing, Gallo hissed, his eyes glittering with malice. This is about him. And your death will be the message that finally burns his empire to the ground. Her father cried out her name, a strangled, terrified sound. This was the moment. The precipice. She was supposed to be a victim. She was supposed to be bait. But she was done playing her part. She lifted her chin, her eyes locked on Gallo's, and with all the air in her lungs, she shouted the code word. Her voice rang out, sharp and clear, cutting through the sound of the rain. The debt is settled. For a split second, nothing happened. Gallo's finger tightened on the trigger. Then, the shadows at the edge of the warehouse exploded into motion. Figures in black emerged from behind rusted machinery and stacks of rotting pallets, moving with a brutal, silent efficiency that was terrifying to behold. Chaos erupted. Shouts, the sickening thud of fists hitting flesh, the clatter of Gallo's gun as it was kicked from his hand. Sophia didn't run. She didn't scream or hide behind the man who was supposed to save her. She stood her ground, a fixed point in the storm of violence. She watched as Gallo was subdued, his arrogant face contorted in a mask of shocked rage. Her gaze moved from him to her father, who had crumpled against a pillar, weeping with a mixture of terror and relief. Then, her eyes found Vincent. He stepped out of the darkness, his presence an undeniable center of gravity in the swirling chaos. Their eyes met across the warehouse floor. He saw her, not cowering, not hiding, but standing tall, her face streaked with rain and resolve. She had followed his plan, but she had done it her way. She had defied them all, the villain, the victim, and the savior, and in the heart of the storm, she had chosen her own path. The ride back to the estate was wrapped in a new kind of silence. The rain had softened to a gentle hiss against the windows, and the violent energy of the warehouse had been replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. Sophia stared out at the slick, dark streets, her reflection a pale ghost in the glass. She had faced a man with a gun. She had saved her father. She had taken control. She should have felt victorious, powerful. Instead, she just felt empty, as if she had poured out every last drop of her old self onto that wet concrete floor. Vincent drove with a steady, focused calm, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. She could feel his presence beside her, a solid wall of quiet intensity. He didn't speak, and she was grateful for it. There were no words for what had happened between them, for the line they had crossed from captor and captive to something far more complicated and dangerous. The iron gates of the estate swung open for them, a silent welcome. As the car crunched up the gravel driveway, Sophia looked at the mansion. Its warm lights glowed against the dark, wet night. It no longer looked like a prison. It looked like a fortress. A sanctuary that had kept the real monsters at bay. The thought was a painful twist in her gut. Inside, the vast entryway was silent and still. The air was clean, the marble floor gleaming. The threat that had haunted these halls was gone, vanquished. The profound quiet felt like a final exhale. Vincent led her to the small, formal sitting room just off the main hall, the one with the unlit fireplace and the cold, velvet chairs. He stopped in the center of the room, turning to face her. Her dress was still damp, and she wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling small and out of place. He watched her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. Then, he reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out the heavy, ornate iron keys. He walked to the polished wood table that stood between them and placed the keys down. The sound of the metal hitting the wood wasn't the deafening, final clang she remembered from the gallery. It was a soft, deliberate click. An offering. "The debt is settled," he said, his voice a low, even murmur that held no triumph, only fact. "Gallo and his operation are finished. Your father is safe." He paused, his gaze holding hers, unwavering and absolute. "You can go home." The words were what she had dreamed of, what she had fought for. Freedom. But hearing them now, in the quiet of this room, they felt like a judgment. She looked from his unreadable face to the keys glinting in the soft light. They were the symbol of her captivity, the weight that had dragged her into this world. Now they were her passport out of it. She thought of her life before, the scent of turpentine, the dusty light of the gallery, the simple joy of a blank page in her sketchbook. Then she thought of her life here, the caged birds, the moonlit garden, the terrifying security of his protection. A treacherous, foolish part of her wanted to ask him to say something more. To give her a reason to stay. To close the distance between them. But she knew that would be the final cage, the most dangerous one of all, because it would be one she walked into willingly. She had fought for her autonomy, and she would not surrender it now, not even for the strange, magnetic pull of the man who had stolen it from her. She walked to the table. Her hand was steady as she reached out. She didn't snatch the keys this time. She picked them up, her fingers closing around the cold metal. They felt different in her palm. Lighter. She was not a prisoner taking her chance to escape. She was the master of these keys now. They would open the gates because she commanded it. She looked at him one last time, meeting his intense gaze. "Thank you," she said. The words were small and wholly inadequate, a tiny boat in an ocean of unspoken things. Vincent didn't offer a platitude. He just gave a single, slow nod. His face was a mask of control, but she could see the storm in his eyes. He had made her a promise in the car, and he was a man who honored his deals, no matter the cost. He was letting her go. Sophia turned and walked out of the room. She did not run. She walked with a deliberate, measured pace through the grand entryway, her footsteps echoing on the marble. She felt the eyes of the silent staff on her as she passed. She kept her gaze fixed on the massive, dark wood of the front doors. She did not look back. She knew with a bone-deep certainty that if she looked back, she would break. She pulled the heavy door open herself and stepped out into the cool, clean night. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. She walked down the stone steps and along the gravel path, the keys clutched tightly in her fist. The iron gate stood ajar, waiting. She put her hand on the cold, intricate metal and pushed. The gate swung open with a soft, mournful creak. She stepped through, leaving the manicured grounds behind for the cracked concrete of a public sidewalk. She was free. She walked down the dark, quiet street, away from the mansion's glowing windows, away from the complicated man who was still watching her go, and she never, ever looked back. 6 months. It was long enough to rebuild a life from the ashes, and short enough that the phantom weight of iron keys sometimes still surfaced in her palm. The Turner Gallery wasn't just reborn, it was breathing. The air, once thick with the scent of old paper and desperation, now buzzed with the energy of a packed opening night. Laughter and the clinking of glasses replaced the heavy silence she remembered. Her name was on the wall, printed in bold, clean letters beneath the exhibition title. Not as collateral, but as the artist. Sophia moved through the crowd, a small, genuine smile on her face. She was no longer the frightened girl from the dusty gallery. She was confident, her posture straight, her gaze direct. She spoke about her work, about the charcoal lines and the stories they told, and her voice didn't tremble once. She was healed. She was in control. Then she saw him. He was standing near the back, partially obscured by a stone pillar, a ghost in a perfectly tailored dark suit. The crowded room, the buzz of conversation, the warmth of the lights, it all dissolved into a muted hum. Her world narrowed to a single point. Vincent Hayes. He looked exactly the same, an island of dangerous calm and a sea of celebration. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at her work. His gaze was fixed on the largest piece in the collection, the centerpiece of her exhibition. It was a stark, powerful charcoal drawing of a gilded cage, its door broken and hanging open. From it, a flurry of birds burst forth, their wings a frantic, joyful blur of motion as they soared towards an unseen sky. The title was printed on a small plaque beside it, Caged Birds Taking Flight. It felt like he was reading a page from her soul, a secret diary she had written in charcoal, and hung on the wall for the world to see. As if he sensed her stare, his head slowly turned. Their eyes met across the crowded space, and the 6 months between then and now collapsed into a single, breathless second. There was no menace in his gaze, no hint of ownership. There was only a quiet, profound intensity. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement. A release. He held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent conversation passing between them that no one else in the room could ever understand. Then, he gave a slow, respectful nod. It was a gesture of finality, of closure. An ending. And just like that, he turned. He didn't say a word. He didn't make a scene. He simply melted back into the shadows near the doorway and disappeared into the Chicago night. Sophia stood frozen for a moment, her heart a heavy, steady drum in her chest. The noise of the party rushed back in, but it sounded different now, clearer. The final chain had been broken. The next morning, the gallery was quiet, filled with the peaceful aftermath of success. Her manager, a bright young woman named Chloe, came into the back office, her face glowing with an excitement that was almost frantic. "Sophia, you are not going to believe this," Chloe said, waving a piece of paper. "A wire transfer came through an hour ago. A massive, anonymous donation. Enough to secure the gallery's lease for the next 10 years. Enough to fund the next dozen exhibitions." Chloe's eyes were wide with disbelief. "It just says it's from a patron of the arts." Sophia didn't feel the shock she should have. A slow, knowing smile spread across her face. She didn't have to ask who it was from. A ghost. A king. An anonymous patron. She walked to the gallery's large front window, the donation letter still in Chloe's hand behind her. She looked out at the familiar skyline, at the towers of glass and steel that glittered under the morning sun. She was free. And she was protected. but this time, it was on her own terms. The silent pact remained, a thread of darkness woven into the bright tapestry of her new life, a secret she would carry forever. If you enjoyed the video, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel to keep up with our content.